Good morning. My name is Ada Skiles, and I'm the Associate Director at Chapin Hall. On behalf of Chapin Hall, I would like to welcome you to our Child and Family Policy Forum today. We would like to thank those of you who are here with us in person and those joining us on our live video webcast for taking the time to be with us today. Today's program is entitled Child Welfare, Race, and Disparity, New Findings, New Opportunities. I know you will find today's conversation both lively and informative. Moderating our panel of experts on this topic is the Executive Director of Chapin Hall, Matt Stagner. Again, thank you very much for participating in today's program. I'll now turn over the program to Matt, who will introduce our panel of experts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ada, and thanks to those of you who joined us live here in Chicago. We have about 100 people at the Gleacher Center, and we have, I think, over 1,000 sites logged in, I'll say nationwide, perhaps worldwide, to listen to this on the web and to view it. It's a great pleasure to be able to host this event. It's an important turning point, we hope, for a very key conversation in child welfare. Racial disparity is an increasingly pressing problem, and the fact that Black children enter foster care at higher rates than white children is well established. But as this panel will discuss, there are many questions beyond that, and perhaps some ways of looking at this that can lead us to new ways to think about solutions to the problem. And my first introduction will be of Fred Wulczyn, who's a senior fellow at Chapin Hall, a recent recipient of the Flynn Prize for Research, and is one of the key researchers not only in child welfare, but especially in understanding this important issue in child welfare. So Fred will lay out a different way of thinking about this problem, and then we have three important panelists with a vast amount of experience who will help us frame the issue further. We'll try to finish with about 30 minutes or so for conversation. I have people tweeting and sending in Facebook questions up here. This is something that I'm not quite used to balancing, but I'll try to not overly favor the social media, but also look for questions and conversation in the room here. So as we move into that, I'll try to go back and forth. Those of you who are listening on the web should feel free to ask questions at any point, and I'll come in and do that. Our other three panelists, we're very pleased to have them. To Fred's left is John Mattingly, a familiar person to many of you who followed child welfare over the last couple of decades. He's now a senior fellow at the Annie E. Casey Foundation in Baltimore. But from 2004 to 2011, he was commissioner of the New York City Administration for Children's Services. And I'm not sure that that's a Cal Ripken-like record, but it's a long type of, it's a long tenure in a big urban child welfare system, as many of you know, and John brought a lot to that and has a lot of reflections, I'm sure, on that experience. To John's left is Eric Fenner. He is a managing director of one of the 4 strategic consulting teams at Casey Family Programs. So we will be getting a perspective both from Annie E. Casey as well as Casey Family Programs. As most of you know, those 2 organizations are key to improvements in child welfare across the nation. And then finally, we have Lonnie Snowden, who is a professor in the School of Public Health at the University of California, Berkeley. And Lonnie will be providing our final point of discussion on this. So with this, I will turn it over to Fred to begin, and we'll move through and get to questions and answers after each of our panelists talk.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's a real pleasure to see all of you, to know that there are lots of people out there that are listening in. It's frankly a bit overwhelming. My job today is to sort of set some foundational put out some foundational information that the panelists following me will discuss. The principal aim here is to look forward, to think about how the next generation of questions and the answers to those questions will inform what we do about this extremely important issue. And my job, as I said, will be to try and lay the foundation for that. I think it's important to first talk a little bit about the support and collaboration. We, like many of folks working in the child welfare area, have benefited tremendously from the support of the Annie E. Casey Foundation and Casey Family Programs. It was an investment in the State Data Center a number of years ago that actually is largely responsible for what we're able to talk about today. And so it's with a sincere debt of gratitude, and I see Doug Nelson here, who was there at the time, and my hope is that this represents some measure of return on that investment. But I have to acknowledge the members of the State Data Center, the state child welfare leaders who invest in the capacity to follow what's going on in their complex systems. And without their support of the Data Center, I don't think we would be as far along as we are. And then specific collaborators, Robert Gibbons at the University of Chicago is a world-class biostatistician who has helped tremendously with sort of solving the problem of how do we understand this issue and what are the ways in which we can hold up a mirror to see what exactly is going on with far greater clarity than in the past. Lonnie Snowden, who you'll meet a bit later on, he too has been part of the collaboration with Robert, again, with the goal of understanding what it is we see when we look at the data in the ways we're trying to adopt. And I also want to acknowledge Ada Skiles. She, you met her already this morning. She has, over the years, prodded me, if you will, to keep looking at this issue. And I think without her encouragement, I might have been distracted by other issues. But clearly, her encouragement, her sense that this is a deeply important issue has helped me sort of stay on task. And I think that, thank you, Ada, for that. Bridget Leary from my staff, who has helped organize data, get stuff analyzed, look through what we find, and served as a sounding board, her contributions as well. And I also want to just mention, we are clearly not the only people looking at this issue. Barbara Needell is in the audience today, Nancy Rolock. There are a lot of people looking at this issue. It's gaining the attention that it richly deserves. And so just to simply be a part of that conversation with so many talented people is an honor and a privilege for me. I sort of eschew the idea that I'm any kind of an expert on this issue, because the more I look at it, the more I realize I don't know very much, and experts are supposed to be people who actually know something, and I'm not sure that is the case in this particular instance. But so what I want to do today is I want to share with you some things that we have found along the way of trying to figure out what this issue is, and see whether you have the same reaction that I had, which is sort of a combination of disbelief and bewilderment, really, in terms of, well, what is this saying about the narrative that we have with regard to the issue of race and disparity in the child welfare system? And you'll see, perhaps, or I hope certainly that will be evident. So quick overview from my perspective. I'm going to outline the work and try to provide you with a rationale. As I said, I'm going to share some of the questions that I have that have emerged out of this. And then we're going to turn to the panelists for their reaction. If you know the panelists at all, you know that they'll comment on my presentation, but they'll likely comment on other matters of concern to them, which they're perfectly welcome to do. I think that enriches the conversation. And then we're going to turn to the audience for your reaction, because I think this is really about a dialogue with the community of stakeholders who have an interest in this issue to help us unravel, if you will, this extremely important puzzle. So I'm going to start with the premise and then sort of walk you through the logic of how we sort of got to where we are today. So in my judgment, it's time for a transition in the conversation about child welfare, race, and disparity. Historically, we've concerned ourselves with the question, do black children have different experiences with the child welfare system than white children? More broadly, when children from one group or another are compared with other groups, as being Hispanic, Black, Asian, American Indian, or white, make a difference, net of whatever else you can measure about those children, their families, and their communities. And the answer, of course, is yes, it does matter. It matters a lot. The question's certainly not closed, but there's been a substantial amount of work done to answer that question, and I think the answer is quite clear. It matters a lot. Now we need to add some new facets to the conversation. With respect to the explanation for why disparity exists, there are several explanations, and it may be the case that they coexist. Is the difference based on need or unequal treatment? Is it policy? Is it practice? Or is it that all 3 or 4 reasons are mixed together with a different emphasis depending upon where and when one is looking? With respect to racism specifically, we know that it is pernicious, but we don't know per se whether its perniciousness reveals itself in the same way all the time and everywhere. We need an answer to that question. So to that end, if we want to move the conversation along, not change the conversation, but allow it to mature, the questions will have to change, and the alignment of the answers to those questions and our strategy will need to be refreshed. So what new questions are there? How do we evolve the conversation? What is the gap between what we know and what we need to know to be effective in our efforts to address the issues? So there's one gap that I think is fairly important, and that has to do with where is disparity the greatest? We've tended to focus on the question of, is there disparity? We're going to set that question aside for the time being. We're going to ask the question, where is it the greatest? Where is it the least? And how does that relate to the answer, why is there disparity? It's an important question, but there's very little systematically gathered information that informs the field. There's also very little information around the answers to the follow-up question, do the places where we tend to find disparity share anything else in common? A number of us have spent a couple of years trying to develop an answer to this set of questions, and here's what we did. As I said, the first thing we did was we changed the question from, is there disparity, to, do we see the same level and type of disparity everywhere we look? Ultimately, we would like to say, or pinpoint the places where we can say, the level of disparity we observe in, and then fill in the blank, this place. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by the phrase place a bit later on. But is the level of disparity we observe in this place, is it above average? And is the difference too large for chance to be at work? Empirically, we see a small number of counties on the issue of placement rate entry into out-of-home care. We actually do find a few places where whites are more likely to enter than blacks. When we talk about exits from foster care, we find quite a few places where black children leave more quickly and are more likely to achieve permanency than whites are. It's not everywhere, but what is it about those places where we observe that? And there's good reason to ask whether, in the light of that data, the face of disparity in those places will be, quote unquote, the same. So with that in mind, we sharpened the question. To address the data, we looked at the question of entry disparities. We'll also present some data on maltreatment disparities. But our focus is on, in any given place relative to other places, one has to know the rate of entry for blacks and the rate of entry for whites. And with those two numbers, we can calculate a standard disparity ratio, which is one of the many, but an important statistic in this conversation. And then with those measures in hand, we can explore the question of how the disparity ratio varies over place, over time, at different points in the system. A lot of very rich questions. So how might places differ? Well, one could start the answer to this question from a number of perspectives. We're going to start with the ecological character of the counties and states where kids live. The reason for starting there is a couple reasons. First of all, a common explanation for why disparity exists is tied to the conditions in which blacks live. The ecological character of the places is how I'll refer to it. The chain of reasoning goes something like this. Families that live in the midst of social and economic disadvantage face tougher challenges when raising their children. There are fewer protective factors within their reach. Black families are more likely to be found in settings that are characterized by social and economic disadvantage. And on balance, the rates of contact with the child welfare system for blacks will likely be higher than for whites, and thus accounts for one, but only one, of the complex dynamics that are behind this issue. Second, there's almost no research that actually explores this issue, oddly enough. There's very little research in the formal refereed journal realm out there that actually looks what is the rate of placement in relationship to poverty. Surprisingly enough, there are a lot of assertions about the relationship, but there's actually very little formal research that addresses the issue. And then third, and perhaps most importantly, it was relatively easy to get our hands on that data. The census collects good social and economic data, and we can probe the question and gain whatever insights that has to offer with relative ease. So what was our approach? Well, placement is measured as a rate per thousand for blacks and whites separately. So we have a placement rate for blacks per thousand children, placement rate for whites per thousand for white children, and we divide the black rate by the white rate to create a disparity ratio. Again, it's the standard approach to this issue. It's one of many measures, but it is an important fundamental measure in this literature. Social and economic disadvantaged are also measured separately for blacks and whites, and that's a key distinguishing feature of the work that we're doing. We're disaggregating rates of entry for both whites and blacks, but we're doing the same thing on the other side. That is, the conditions in which whites and blacks are being looked at. We use a measure of social capital, family structure. Two-parent families have richer social networks, and so it's a protective factor with respect to, on average, the conditions that children are being raised in. We use a measure of human capital, adult education levels. We want to know how much education people have in the places where we're looking. And finally, we use a measure of economic climate, and that's the unemployment rate. We want to know how unemployment, family structure, and education levels are related to the issue of entry into out-of-home care. We combine these indicators to form a simple scale, not suggesting that we've done all the work that one might want to do or choose to do when looking at scales of social and economic disadvantage. But we had to reduce the data down so that we could create some clarity in the picture because it's a complicated story. I'll try to keep it simple, but the scale helped us understand it. So counties that have more families headed by females, more uneducated adults, and more unemployed persons, and more residents living in rented housing. I failed to mention that, but we also looked at the number of households living in renter-occupied housing. And where you have more of those things, you're at the top of the scale and is regarded as living in conditions of greater social disadvantage. At the other end of the scale, where you have more educated people, more employed people, more children living in two-parent families, more owner-occupied housing, we're going to refer to those as places where the level of social disadvantage is lower. It's important to stress again that the scales for whites and blacks is very different. You'll see that in the data. It's an important dimension of this problem. When I say white social disorganization and black social disorganization, they are in very different scales. So we have to be very clear about that, but it's also one of the key insights that the data reveal. And so the findings. Well, those are the basic questions. Where is disparity the greatest? What else can we say about the places where we find different levels of characteristics? And we're going to focus on the social or ecological characteristics of placement. I've defined disparity for you already. And what are we looking for? A way to talk about the role of social and economic disadvantage relative to disparity. Are the poorest counties, let's use that shorthand for the time being, are the poorest counties the places where we find the greatest disparity? In the GAO report in 2008, that was the conclusion they reached, that poverty explains disparity. Yet they did not do any direct analysis behind that assertion. They did not look at state disparity ratios and state poverty rates and see whether or not the covariation of those two variables bore any resemblance to the conclusion they reached. None. Yet it was such a powerful conclusion in the way that it galvanized public commentary about the issue, but no analysis of the issue behind the assertion. So we're going to start with that assertion, looking at maltreatment rates by state poverty rates. The dots here are the paired results of the state poverty rate, child poverty in this case, and the victimization rate from the 2006 maltreatment report that HHS puts out using the NCANS data. The dots are, again, the poverty rate and the victimization rate. The line through the middle there describes the relationship. Does an increase in state poverty rates relate to an increase in state maltreatment rates? And the positive slope from left to right is an indication that indeed there is a relationship between the two. Although when I did this, I was kind of surprised that it wasn't a little stronger, that the slope of that line wasn't a little steeper. But nevertheless, there's the positive relationship that everyone expects to find. Let's divide now by white child poverty and white child victimization rates. How cool is that? You'll see here that, again, we have the same positive slope, that as the states have higher white child poverty rates, they have higher white child maltreatment rates. You'll note that the line is a little bit steeper. It suggests a stronger relationship for whites than for the general population as a whole. Well, that obviously has implications for what we're going to see when we look at the rate, the comparable data for blacks. You'll see now that the line shifts to the left, or to the right. To the right? You're right. That's because poverty rates are generally much higher for blacks than they are for whites. So this distribution of black poverty shifts and reflects the higher rates. You'll also know that the dots are more dispersed around the line. That means there's greater variability in the black poverty rates. These are important features that we have to understand when looking at the issue of disparity. But the signature finding here is that that line is basically parallel to the x-axis, which means that black child poverty and black child maltreatment rates at the state level don't have a relationship. That as you look at states with varying rates of black child poverty, we tend not to find differences in the black child maltreatment rate. That is in direct contraindication as to what the GAO concluded and what the field generally assumes to be the case. It would be nice to know why that's true. But the implications for disparity are that in states with high rates of child poverty, without regard to race, that the disparity rate is much smaller than it is in places with lower rates of child poverty. Precisely the opposite we would have expected to find. You'll notice that there are quite a few states that have no disparity. The one, see if I can clarify this, use this. Right there. Now you know why I'm not a brain surgeon. That collection of dots right there means there's very little disparity in those places. It would be nice to know whether or not those places share anything in common as we think about, well, there actually are some places where there's very little disparity. It says nothing about whether or not there's a reason for it, as in a good reason that there would be no disparity. It's simply an observation that there are quite a few states where we actually don't see very much. Now, it's for this year, 2006. Is it true? Was it true in 2007, 2008, 2009? We don't know. It would be nice to know whether or not this is a stable attribute of those places, but we don't know. When we look at white child poverty, we see the same issue. Disparity is lower in places where white child poverty is higher. When we look at black child poverty, we see the same general relationship, but it's not as steep. Why? Should we know the answer to that question? We don't. Without an answer to that question, how do we invest in making it better when we're not taking into account basic facts about what is going on? Let's take a look at placement rates and social disadvantage. Here we're looking at black child placement rates, and we're using our social index to, we're actually looking at black child poverty here. And we're looking at counties that have in the vicinity of a 30% black child poverty rate and counties that have a vicinity of a 50% black child poverty rate. We would have expected that the rate of entry into out-of-home care in places with higher concentrations of black children living in poverty, that the placement rate in those places would be higher. It's not. Why? How does it relate to the narrative we have about the role of the various explanations that we have? Let's take a more complicated look. Let's take a look at social disadvantage. These are the measures combined in the way that I described earlier. We have areas with low social disadvantage. These are relatively speaking, socially organized places in which to raise children. Here are high disadvantage. These are relatively disorganized places with respect to the prospects of raising children. Low social capital, low human capital, high unemployment, people living in rented housing. When we look there, we find that the placement rates with high social disadvantage have lower placement rates than places with less social disadvantage. Why? We don't know. When we look at disparity, we find along the index of social disadvantage from low to high, that disparity is lower in places with high disadvantage. That is to say, the black-white gap, it doesn't go away by any stretch of the imagination. There is still a significant gap there to concern ourselves with. But it's much smaller in places of high social disadvantage than in low social disadvantage. Why is that? Is it because when we look in those places, white children and black children are more likely to be treated the same way, i.e. poorly? That is to say, there is no discrimination based on race. We don't do a very good job with anybody in those places. We don't know the answer to that question. Is there something protective going on in the black community in those places which allow those placement rates to be lower in those places? Is that a signal of the strength of the black community, the Hispanic community, if we were to find the same thing? We don't know the answer to that question. How are we going to invest in solutions without the answer to these very basic questions, without incorporating these data into the narrative about what it means to run a child welfare system that serves a diverse population of children and families, a diverse population of communities? How do we solve the problem without that conversation? So in conclusion, I would be kidding myself, and I would be kidding you if you were to walk away believing that we're the only ones looking at these questions. So I'll just reference very quickly the work of Claudia Colton at Case Western and Brett Drake at George Warren Brown, St. Louis University. They have been on this path for a long time, looking at the differences in the experience of black children and white children. I would also be kidding myself and you as well if I thought that this was the end of the conversation. I think I've tried to indicate that it's certainly not my belief. But where could we go? What could we add in the short term that strengthens the analysis? Well, system effects. These are very different systems across these various counties. What is it about the systems themselves that generate these outcomes? There are policy effects. What about the state policy context in which these children are coming into the system? States have very different policy environments. Does that account for it? We haven't talked at all about is this the same for babies? Is it the same for teens? We know that disparity is more acute for children under the age of 1 than it is for children of older ages. Would these same findings hold up there? I don't know. But it's an important question, because if we're going to target resources with the expectation that we'll understand whether those investments paid off in the way we intended them to pay off, we're going to have to disaggregate the problem further than we have. What does where mean? Where can be counties, it can be states, it can be regions, it can be points along the process of entry into the child welfare system through the various decision points. The issue is where is indicative of the underlying question of where is it different? Not is there disparity there, but where does whatever difference we find vary over that unit of aggregation? And finally, I think we want to talk about bringing the narrative together with the findings. It's not a question of setting aside one or the other of the many explanations that are out there. It's a question of how do we incorporate all of those narratives into a single unified idea as to what is going on and what can we do about it in a way that respects the diversity of the likely conclusions we'll reach. And finally, we have to invest in equity. It's not about services for this group or that group. All children benefit if the quality of the child welfare system is the best we can make it. And if we can accomplish that, the rising tide will lift all children and families. Thank you very much for your time.
I believe we turn to Eric next. Is that correct?
Well, good morning. I can push this down a little bit. First, let me tell you that I am not a researcher. So I don't have any pretty PowerPoints with all kinds of graphs and colors. I am a child welfare practitioner. I heard our director, David Sanders, use the best analogy to describe a child welfare director. How many of you saw the movie The Godfather series? Okay, I can almost tell this audience by the hands that go up, the age difference. But there was a scene in The Godfather 2 where Michael and his wife are in the bedroom and he notices that the curtains are open and all of a sudden a hail of bullets comes into the bedroom. That's sort of like being a child welfare director. Every morning there's a chance that a hail of bullets are going to come through the window. I'm going to tell you a story about how a child welfare agency was able to truly impact the overrepresentation of African-American children in foster care, but also how we were able to impact disparities in treatment and services that those children receive. But I do need to make at least one statement about myself because I think it's important that you understand how I come to this work and how I think about this work. I grew up in inner city Washington, D.C., in a poor neighborhood. And I think that if you were to see a data strip about who I was and where I came from, you'd have a pretty shortened perspective about who I am and where I came from. If you didn't have a chance to meet me and know me or to come to my neighborhood, the neighborhood that I grew up in, if you just saw that on a data map and you looked at the income of that neighborhood and the condition of that neighborhood, you'd walk away with one perspective. But if you came to that neighborhood and you spent a few days with the children and the parents and the families in that neighborhood, you'd walk away with a very different perspective. So as I come to the work of child welfare, I came to it, I retired. I've got to get used to that notion. I've retired from child welfare. I came to that work from a very different perspective, and that was that it's more than the data and the research. It's really about the people and who they are and where they come from. I retired in April of this past year as the executive director of Franklin County Children's Services. Franklin County is a large urban child welfare agency, really the largest child welfare operation in the state of Ohio. I was the first African-American executive director in the organization's almost 75 years of existence. The expectations and concerns from both our African-American employees and our white employees when I came on board were completely unrealistic. I think for the most part, I think there were two reasons. One, I think the African-American employees thought, we finally have an African-American executive director, he is going to eliminate this whole idea of disproportionality. And I think the other unrealistic expectation came from the fact that I was a child welfare caseworker. That's how I started. Ed Sparks back here gave me my very first job in child welfare. And there are days when I want to hug him, and there are days when I want to put my hands around his throat. But I think that because I was the first director who had ever actually done the work, I think there was a different set of expectations for how I would go about it. One of the things about studies and all the work that's been done around disproportionality that fascinates me is that we have been aware of the overrepresentation of African American children since 1972. I was 16 years old in 1972. A study that was done by Billingsley and Giovanni, I know I was going to mess up his name, talked about this overrepresentation. And here we sit 40 years later, and we're still debating it. Disparities in child welfare are a complex phenomenon that cannot be explained with a single factor. Now, this microphone is shaking, but I am not shaking, so there must be something else at work here. I am convinced that racial bias, specific to decision-making as a case progresses through the child welfare system, is a critically important consideration when trying to explain disproportionality and disparities. If you don't address racial bias in your organizational practices, I don't think it really matters what else you do. You will continue to experience both overrepresentation and disparities when it comes to treatment and approaches. Now, if I were an intelligent person, I would stop right there, because nothing else am I going to say that's going to be more impactful than that statement. When I became the director, I knew we had to do something about the overrepresentation of African American children in our system. But I did believe that if we address disparities in treatment and approaches, we would impact the overrepresentation. It was my thinking that a lack of access to quality services was a real contributor to disparities in treatment. I decided to take a different approach when we wanted to address this. Our agency had a long history of talking about racial issues from a distance. I remember a colossal mistake we made about 25 years ago. We brought on board a speaker to talk about race relations. That's how the field has progressed. We called it race relations back then. I won't use the speaker's name because he may still be out there working. But he basically got in the face of our white employees and basically said, because you're racist, we have this overrepresentation of children in our care. I don't know of anything that has caused more damage in our agency than that one-day presentation that was mandated to all of our staff. Our leaders handled it horribly. There was no follow-up. There was no discussion. Basically, our staff were left with these gaping wounds that had been inflicted upon them by the speaker. It separated our agency, and it took us almost 20 years to at least get to a point where trust was restored. In 2007, the agency was quite different. We had a lot of young people. In fact, 42% of all of our staff, specifically our casework staff, were under the age of 25. And these young folks under the age of 25 were a lot smarter than we were when we were 25. And I learned a very valuable lesson in working with young people. If you engage them, both in the identification of the problem and the strategies you want to engage to address those problems, it's amazing how far you can go. We put together a disproportionality task force made up of African American and white workers. We had co-chairs, African American and white. We began with a very basic premise that I gave the task force, that individuals could not be racist, that they could be and probably were biased and probably held preconceived notions and ideas about who people are, but that they could not be racist. And the reason that they could not be racist is because they lacked one fundamental element, and that was power. Individuals can hold those thoughts and beliefs about individuals, but they don't have the power to hold you in an oppressive state of existence. Bear with me. I use this analogy. If I don't like you, I don't like the way you're treating me, I can simply move away from you. But if I don't like the way you investigate me as a representative from Franklin County Children's Services, I can't ignore you. You have the authority to investigate me. You have the authority to tell me how I should treat my children. You have the authority to tell me how I should raise my children. And you have the authority to terminate my parental rights. That's power. As a representative of that institution, that's where we believe, for the purposes and for the focus of our work, that's where racism existed. Prejudice exists with you all as individuals. And we wanted to make that fundamental difference. And part of the reason why we wanted to do that was because I wanted our staff to see that this was an institutional problem, not an individual person problem. And once we were able to come together with that mentality, you'll be impressed with the work we were able to do. We began by looking at all of our decision points. And we deliberately didn't look at who made the referrals to our agency or even where the children lived. We looked at that later, but for the beginning, we wanted to focus on what was within our control. What was it that we did every single day that could be impacted? So we would start to look at all of our data from the previous year. Once a referral was accepted, we looked at whether the case was opened or whether the case was referred out for community services. Did we file in court, or did we open the case and provide ongoing services without a court filing? Did we place the child in foster care? Was the child placed with relatives or friends? Or was the child not placed at all? What we discovered was really very interesting. The reality was that beyond our delinquent population, which were the kids coming from the juvenile court, there was very little variance in those decisions. We did find that African-American children were referred to our agency almost 2-to-1 to white children. As we looked a little bit closer at the individual cases, we found that when a case was opened, African-American children were almost always rated at a higher risk. But here was the piece that was the real eye-opener for our staff. When we looked at those cases, we found almost no difference between whether the worker was African-American or whether the worker was white. What was important about that point to a room filled with eager, go-getter caseworkers was that this issue was all ours to own and to correct, and that it was not one individual's responsibility or one group of people to make this change. We all had to do that. You've heard, well, I think I've more read Fred's writing where he makes reference to the face of bias. This example, I think, demonstrates that the face of bias is with all of us in child welfare. All of us who were in that organization, at least talking about my own agency, we were the ones who were making those decisions. And it was really interesting once people came to the realization that this was something that we were doing as an organization. Only then could we really begin to look at what we really could do as a group working together. We then, of course, went out to look at where referrals coming from, and more importantly, where do these children live, and what are the resources available in those communities. Needless to say, many of the children were from poor environments, no question about that. I think that's been studied over and over. But there were very few resources. But we did discover one jewel. In Franklin County, we have what's called settlement houses. And settlement houses are gathering places that exist in pretty much every African-American neighborhood. They provide after-school programs, recreational programs, parent training programs. There were gathering places that during the civil rights movement, speakers would come, and this is where they would come to speak, and this is where they would come to stay. Grandparents had gone to the settlement houses, parents had gone to the settlement houses, But as a child welfare agency, we had never connected with those settlement houses, and they had been around for 100 years. We reached out to the settlement houses, and we started to talk about the services that would benefit a majority of the children who were coming into our care. Now, the reality is most of those kids really had issues and problems and concerns that really could be addressed on a voluntary basis. I should add that we also became a differential response county, which gave us another approach from the traditional investigative approach to allegations of child maltreatment. We could use an assessment-based family engagement approach, and by engaging our families at that level, we found that we didn't have to open those cases formally, and those children didn't have to come into our care. Of course, after a very short time, we started to put more money into the settlement houses. When I left, we had about $1.2 million invested in programs and services in partnership with those settlement houses. And here's what we found. Many of those settlement houses were within walking distance to the children and families that we were serving. It was so much easier to go to an after-school program that was 2 blocks away than to go see a therapist that was on the other side of town once a week. And because we had recreational activities that were made available, of course, after you did your homework and your parents gave reports about how you were behaving in the home, things got better and better and better. I did bring some stats to show you about what those numbers really look like after a 5-year period. In 2005, now remember, I became the director in 2007, so things got a lot better in 2007, but I'm going to give you 2005. We had 6,382 children on our caseloads. 3,000 of those children were African-American, 47%. 2,744, or 43%, were white, and 638, 10%, was other. In 2010, we had 4,535 children on our caseloads. 1,995, or 44%, of those children were white. 1,859, or 41%, was African American. A reduction of 1,140 children, or 6%. Now, this is one county in one community and one very charismatic executive director. But here's the point. These numbers can be impacted. Yes, it takes leadership. It takes a sense of commitment on the part of the workers in that organization. If our black workers see this as a white problem and our white workers see this as a black problem, we do what we continue to do for the last 40 years, and that is we talk about it. When both groups see that this is an issue that's a concern for all of us, that it's a negative representation of our organization, that's when we can start to move change. And lastly, and most importantly, you have to partner with your community. The community where these children live, as well as the community outside of where these children live, because this is all, and this is the way we presented it, this was all a reflection of Franklin County. And this is really interesting. I had the opportunity to do a presentation to our business community. And I had to kind of fight for that because I said, if someone's interested in bringing a business into this community, don't you think they'd want to know what the social structure is? What kind of programs and services are available? So my presentation was that this is our community. All of it, all 1.2 million people, this is our community. And how can any of us rest and sleep when we know that there is a population, a significant population of our children that are being treated unfairly because they don't have access to the same services that all other children have? Armed with that commitment, we made a difference. Thank you for your time.
Now to another charismatic former child welfare leader, John Mattingly.
Like Eric, I approached this presentation not as a foundation representative, certainly not as an expert in child welfare research, but as a practitioner, someone who will attempt to represent in my weak way the experience of people in the field, the experience that is being had today and that will be had tonight all across this country, and which I think deserves great attention as a critically important public service that deserves our support and also deserves our scrutiny. Now, as background, I would stipulate from the outset that I have had some serious concerns about some of the prior work done on the question of disparities in child welfare outcomes, going back a number of years. These concerns arose as I tried to manage agencies whose clients were sometimes more than 90% families of color, whose staff reflected the makeup of the communities they served. Of course, in New York, they were actually from the very same communities, but who felt blamed by the simplistic explanations of the disparity issue, that it was caused simply by institutional racism within their agencies, and who searched in vain for organized responses to disparities. They searched in vain, and they also searched in good faith. Thankfully, I think, more recent research, often based on the NIS4 data, has offered us a much clearer and potentially more nuanced picture of the facts involved in the disparate impact of the child welfare system on families of color, particularly African-American families. To be clear, disparities exist throughout the system. We still have no sound explanation for much of them. However, the research we are discussing today offers us, I think, the opening of new areas for action in the field. And most clearly, it offers us a direction for continued research that may offer us help to address these disparities more effectively. Let me first lay out what I believe are now generally accepted principles of the current work on disparities, since I hope not to be misunderstood or misrepresented, something that does happen in discussions about this understandably highly charged issue. First, children of color, specifically African American and Native American children and Hispanic children in some communities, are more likely to have their cases substantiated. They're more likely to enter out-of-home care. They're more likely to stay longer in foster care, in temporary foster care, and they are less likely to exit foster care through reunification or legal guardianship than other children coming to the attention of child welfare agencies. This remains a very troubling fact and reflects, I believe, the continuing impact of our society's troubled history and current situation. Second, this, of course, has serious implications for the families involved. Authoritative intervention by public agents into the lives of families is extremely disruptive to family functioning. We do not want any child or family to be hurt by having to face such authoritative intervention unnecessarily because of race or ethnicity. At the same time, children who are being harmed often need the protection offered by the child welfare system. So we want to be sure that no one is being kept out of the child protection system because of race or ethnicity. All children have a right to the community's protection when their caretakers are unwilling or unable to provide that protection. From the viewpoint of the field, where real decisions have to be made every day, this is the nub of the issue. To repeat, we do not want any child or family to be hurt by having to face authoritative intervention unnecessarily because of race or ethnicity. But at the same time, all children have the right to the community's protections when their caretakers are unable or unwilling to provide that protection. Recent evidence, I think, indicates that there are significant differences in the need for child welfare intervention by race. African American children are in fact at greater risk of child maltreatment than white children across the entire society. This should not be surprising to us given the high correlation between maltreatment and poverty and the higher rates of poverty and social disorganization facing African American families. Looking more closely at the association of race and the incidence of abuse or neglect could better delineate the complicated relationship between race and incidence when other factors that are highly correlated with maltreatment are taken into account, as I think they must be. It also appears from current studies that differences in rates of reporting for child abuse and neglect among African American and white children are consistent with observed differences in incidence. In sum, when we observe differences, we cannot be sure that there aren't factors other than race that might explain some of these differences. But the disparities remain, and they are concerning. While rigorous research has demonstrated that racial bias and discrimination exist in key public systems, including financial lending, employment, education, juvenile justice, and housing, I personally know of no studies that can accurately claim the same for child welfare systems. Certainly the doubt must be there that racial bias and discrimination also exist in our nation's child welfare systems. Yet we have no reason so far to believe that racial bias is the only or even the primary cause of disparities. This knotty problem will not be susceptible to easy answers. I believe that the current study adds substantially to our knowledge about this difficult issue and offers hope for both better understanding of the factors involved and perhaps even the potential for future actions by the field. And Lord knows we need more action by the field. What is added here is the question, I believe, of context. Recent evidence indicates that context is critical. And if context influences disparity, interventions can conceivably be designed that will be better targeted toward reducing disparities. What remains confounding, of course, is that the disparities are greater in communities where overall community need is in fact lower. What occurs to a practitioner from this finding is that we need to look more closely for disparities in systems serving those communities and search for answers to the cause of those disparities. One remains unsure about these issues, I think, because we need so much more research, but this study, I believe, has the potential to move us forward. In sum, I think that we have a few possible areas of work that follow from this new evidence. First, we need more in-depth analyses of those communities with high levels of disparity, even when the social structure of the community is stronger overall. Second, from a practitioner's perspective, I also believe that we must intensify efforts to improve results for all the families we serve in more troubled communities. We need targeted efforts in these high-need communities. We need targeted efforts in these high-need communities. Programs with proven success such as parent advocacy and intensified family visit coaching and, indeed, community partnerships. We should now be warned, however, that these efforts that I propose may, in fact, not move the disparity index for these communities, although they will affect proportionately large numbers of children, of families of color, and are well worth the investment. I'd like to thank Chapin Hall and Fred Wulczyn for pulling together this discussion, and I look forward to further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, John. We'll conclude with Professor Snowden.
I want to begin by making a couple of personal observations. I grew up in the Midwest, in Detroit, as a matter of fact, in an all-black community, and so that gives me an additional reason for being interested in this very exciting work. But I've lived in Northern California for many years now, and I brought what I thought was a winter coat. And when I walked out of the hotel, it became perfectly clear to me that this was a Northern Californian's idea of a winter coat, which was completely substandard. The other thing is to say that I'm currently in a school of public health where I'm pleased to be and find many like-minded colleagues and students with whom I've been privileged to work. But I spent most of my career in a school of social welfare at Berkeley and training social workers, and was very pleased to do that. And my main area of research is disparities, mental health disparities, primarily disparities in levels of mental illness and in treatment access and quality of care, which puts me in touch, of course, with child welfare, because many children in the child welfare system have mental health problems and are referred for treatment. And so the child welfare system is a major player in the world of mental health treatment and disparities. But also, over the years, I've also had other interests in child welfare per se. So I'm pleased to be returning to this area and this very exciting work with Fred and with Robert Gibbons that we have been doing. And I just want to emphasize, I think this finding is really quite startling and really does suggest that we don't understand what's going on, especially in African-American communities, about risk and protective factors, that the usual indicators don't work. And let me just put it this way. I know some of my colleagues whom I know work on asthma, preventable hospitalizations for asthma. And if I were to say to them, look, I have this finding I want to discuss with you. So, it turns out that living in a distressed neighborhood is related to rates of preventable hospitalization for asthma. They would say, yeah. And I would then say, for whites, but not for blacks. There'd be a pause. And then they would say, why don't you go back and check your data? Again, it would be that startling. Okay. So it's good, I think, to begin by, one of the things that makes studying disparities difficult is that we have to approach it from a number of points of view and from at a number of levels of analysis, levels of thinking and analysis. And it's very easy to jump from one level to another without recognizing that that's what we're doing. So I want to just start with some basic distinctions that are important. So we can think about poverty at the individual level, or the individual or the family level, and those two are related, although they're not the same thing. But in any event, some people are poor, and the fact that they lack resources as people affects what they do, and that's an important level, and it's something that we know some things about. It's also possible to think about where you live as a distressed or a poverty or a well-off place. And the characteristics that make that an impoverished or well-off place are above and beyond you or anyone else as an individual. The way it works as a place can be differentiated from the way that individual-level poverty works. And the way it works as a place has to do with things about unspoken assumptions and rules about what you can do. They have to do with the resources that are available. I don't list that there, but I was reminded of that. I'm going to come back to it. And it also has to do with the physical environment, the built environment and the natural physical environment. So where you live, the constraints and opportunities that are available based on the social and the physical characteristics of the environment, we can talk about poverty in that respect as well, which is different, related to but distinguishable from talking about poverty at the individual level. So there's a long history in sociology and a growing research tradition in public health of looking at impoverished places and looking at the consequences of living in an impoverished place. And historically, the University of Chicago Sociology Department, as a matter of fact, is very clearly, it's been a leader in this tradition, going back to the 40s and before. Social disorganization theory was a central theme and a central line of work in the University of Chicago and elsewhere in sociology department. And one of the things, the term social disorganization is useful because it points to the social level. That is, if somebody talks about social disorganization, it's easy to see that what they're talking about is social. The processes they're talking about are social, and they're not talking about individuals. Living in a socially disorganized area affects individuals, but to talk about social disorganization itself is not to talk at the individual level. And then updating this tradition, 30 years or so ago, William Julius Wulczyn, the sociologist who was then at the University of Chicago, wrote a very important book called The Truly Disadvantaged, that was about poverty communities, African-American impoverished communities in Chicago, as a matter of fact, and he tied the existence of these communities or their rise to deindustrialization, that is the moving away of industry that had provided an economic base, and to the transformation, the rise of concentrated poverty and the transformation in norms and the lack of resources that resulted from that. So that he was then pointing to neighborhoods and communities that were transformed and that themselves had created or had provided too few opportunities for people and had created, were associated with certain kinds of social difficulty. Okay, a little later, and continuing to the present day, there's a very important line of work that's really, again, at the social level, but that's the flip side of social disorganization, and that's social capital. So along with the fact that people can create places where there are adverse circumstances, it's also true that people can create places where there are very beneficial circumstances. So, and the summary, a way of describing the beneficial ties that develop between people and the beneficial norms, the trust and reciprocity that develop, is to talk about social capital. And social capital literature has grown, social capital research has grown, and it's sort of the inverse of impoverished communities. And there's a very important study that was done a number of years ago, which shows that the link between living in an impoverished community and in this case it was crime, is mediated by social capital. So on average, impoverished communities have less social capital, but those impoverished communities that have high social capital, and they do exist, those communities look like non-impoverished communities that have high social capital. So it's a key step between living in an impoverished community and violent crime, rates of crime, is social capital. And not all impoverished communities have low social capital. Those that have high social capital look like non-impoverished communities. So I think that's a very important thing to point out. Okay, all right. So actually, and all this talk about impoverished communities, and this is just an aside, but I think it's an important one. All this talk about impoverished communities and social capital and so on is not idle. It turns out there was a particular historical moment when federal housing policy made a dramatic shift in an attempt to break up impoverished communities. Now, that's a controversial step that they took, and the results were not as clear-cut or uniformly beneficial as would have been hoped. Nevertheless, it shows that the idea of places and the consequences of where you live as a place, the characteristics of the community, are important and have policy consequences and can be translated into policy steps. All right, so the work that Fred described that we've done is one approach. How do you measure an impoverished community, a resource-poor community, or a better-off community, a resource-rich community? And there's a tradition of using census indicators to do that. And typically, these are measured at the individual level, but then aggregated to the social level, or to the census tract level, or the state level. And the question then is, well, how do you know whether you're talking about individuals? See, this is where the confusion comes in. If you're measuring things at the individual level and you're aggregating them, how do you know whether you're really talking about social things, or as opposed to talking about individual things? And the answer is, you do a lot of heavy-duty statistics, but it's doable. So we've been in a position in the last number of years, the last couple of decades, to really disentangle in a very convincing way how much is individual and how much is social. And the work that we've been doing, I think, takes advantage of some of those developments. So we're measuring things and aggregating about individuals and families, but the phenomena that we're describing really are characteristics of places, not of people. Okay, now, my public health colleagues who are interested in this are primarily epidemiologists. And they are epidemiologists. My son's an epidemiologist. I don't want to criticize epidemiologists. Some of my best friends are epidemiologists. Even my family members are epidemiologists. But they're somewhat skeptical of this social stuff, So, in fact, in our school, the the person who really invented Len Syme, social epidemiology, was a faculty member for many years. He's still around. I talked to Len. But the other epidemiologists are they like Len, they think he's good, but they don't, this social stuff, it sounds squishy. They would prefer to have really hardcore physical things to look at and measure. So when public health looks at impoverished communities or community level risk for diseases and for other things, a lot of that field is grounded and is oriented toward measuring characteristics of the physical characteristics of the place, being able to count parks and, open spaces, air pollution, how polluted is it? Well, we can measure that in very fine ways. I had a colleague who actually, I was talking to him, we were thinking about putting together a project, and I do some psychiatric emergency stuff, and he said, well, have you thought about air pollution? And I said, well, no, I don't know what that would have to do with psychiatric emergency. I mean, maybe it does, but gee, that's not really something that jumps to mind. But it's something he's comfortable with. It's something he can measure very precisely. Okay, it's a true story. I'm not kidding. All right, so the point I want to make, though, is that the epidemiologists in public health, I think, are really moving much more, especially with GIS, with technology. We can map areas. We can really characterize the physical environment in very precise ways. They're more comfortable with that. That's what they're going to do. But I think this is an opportunity, too, and a necessity to really work on the social side and to try to understand what's going on in African-American communities that produces this flat profile of placement rates, whereas for for blacks, we get this flat profile, whereas for whites, we get the expected rise as you move from less impoverished to more impoverished to more resources, you get higher placement, but not for African Americans. Why is that? What that says to me is that we don't really understand the characteristics that are present in African American communities that permit the usual indicators not to be sensitive. And I think, so something that Eric said, I think settlement houses, right? So maybe there is a tradition of settlement houses in African American communities, maybe more so than in other communities. And so that's mitigating some of the effect in placement rates. That's something we can look at. The point is that our usual ways of counting things and trying to understand community level factors in African American in communities in general doesn't seem to be working in African American communities because we don't get what we think. Either that or there is absolutely nothing about the kind of community, African American community you live in that's related to placement rates. And that's just not plausible. What I think the truth is that instead of that, what's correct is that we're just not measuring in the right way. And once we start doing that, we'll be able to move forward because we'll have some understanding about what the real resources and risk factors are for placement in African American communities, which I don't think we know now. That's what I think is the finding sequence. Okay. So public, as I mentioned, public health is interested in, they're interested in neighborhood, they're interested in community, but they want to, how do they approach it? What are their concerns? Well, they focus on, how pathogens cluster, air pollution, noxious agents, and disease. Are there disease clusters in particular places? And they want to know something about the physical environment and how it contributes. And they do, and so they do mapping, and sometimes they get engaged in some kind of community development as ways of taking political action to reduce lead exposure, for example, something like that. But again, I think, and that has a social component. That is, to mobilize a community certainly involves certain kinds of social considerations and social intervention. But it's a little different from understanding how people are relating to each other in ways that offset the kind of risk that occurs for African Americans and whites living in impoverished communities, which is almost entirely social. And so it's about how people are relating to each other and under what norms. So I think we need to spend more time worrying about that. Okay, I'm going to stop. I don't really think that's necessary. This is from public health. It's just a depiction of how they think about this, and I've already talked about it, and you can't read it anyway. Okay, so just to summarize, I think we need better understanding of how to measure liabilities and assets that contribute to African-American child welfare placement rates because we don't know anything. That's what the findings suggest, that are specific to African-Americans. Then we can do things. I think we should start monitoring placement rates by place. And this is consistent with something Fred was saying too, because there's variation. There's a lot of variation. What is there about one place that contributes more, that leads that place to have higher placement rates for bigger disparities for African Americans than another place? And also something that I just want to touch on, and then I'll stop. Everything I've said so far is static. That is, it treats these things as at a point in time. But in point of fact, there's a very small but very persuasive set of findings to indicate that change. So the things, unemployment exists at a particular moment at a certain rate in particular communities, but unemployment fluctuates, as we have found out in very dramatic ways recently. And it turns out that the change in unemployment rate, not just the static level of unemployment, but changing unemployment, that is more people becoming unemployed, has a particularly strong impact on African Americans because there are fewer resources to absorb the shock. So, and African Americans are more likely to be unemployed more quickly because they're more tenuously tied to the labor market because of discrimination and other things. So the point is there's another perspective here that we should start thinking about, I hope, that's more longitudinal. It looks at change in various things and how that too can affect disparities and child welfare placement rates. So thank you very much, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. We have a few minutes for a couple of questions. I first want to apologize. I understand there are a few technical glitches for some of our web audience, and the presentations, PowerPoint presentations, as well as the web video will be posted for later viewing if any of you had trouble hearing or following this. I've received a couple of questions via Facebook, and I will start with one of those as folks in the audience think about their questions. We have about 10 minutes for questions, though I think our panel would stay and talk afterwards as well, though the webcast will have to come to a close. The first question that came in relates to Fred's work and really a question of how much age of child might be driving this. Can the disparate transition of children of color from child welfare to juvenile justice as they get older, is this possibly what drives some of the differences in disadvantaged neighborhoods where youth disappear from child welfare as they make that transition? So have you been able to look at infants, younger children, and youth differentially and think about that issue yet?
Only in very unsatisfactory ways in some respects. So we do know that disparities at entry into out-of-home care are most acute for younger kids. But we've also observed that over the last decade or so, disparities generally are lower today than they were at the beginning of that period, but that the change in the level of disparity has been differential with respect to age and geography. So in rural parts of the states, disparities are actually on the rise, and they are particularly on the rise for children who are above the age of 12. So it's an important question and part of the sort of story that we have yet to develop. We know that there are these changes in the disparity, but we don't know about the variability in quite the detail that we would need in order to provide a better answer to a very good question.
Great, and you actually touched on a second question which came in, which was whether urban and rural areas have been differentiated in this analysis. I think we have a tendency to first think of the major urban areas in the states because we know much of the child welfare policy issues and population is there, but it's important to make that differentiation.
Right, so I didn't spend a lot of time on the last graph that dealt with the issue of placement disparity by urban and rural distinction. And so disparities tend to be higher in urban areas relative to rural areas, although one of the interesting developments over the last decade, again, is that placement rates largely due to places like New York City, Chicago, LA, rates of entry into out-of-home care in our urban areas are down dramatically. I think that accounts to what we're seeing with regard to overall overrepresentation of Black kids in particular. So it is now the case, sort of generally speaking, that placement rates are higher in non-urban areas than they are in the urban areas. But the disparity is greater in urban areas. So you have lower placements in urban areas, but higher disparity. And so again, that suggests that there are layers to the explanation about how we would look at urban versus rural, largely because, of course, African-American kids or children of color, broadly speaking, tend to be concentrated in the more urban areas, although it's very easy to paint this picture with one brush and in so doing create a false impression about uniformity. But those are the kinds of things we're seeing in general.
Great. Let's take an audience question from here in the room. If anyone has one, we have microphones that can magically travel to you.
Good morning. My name is McQuell Lewis from Cook County Juvenile Court. I work for the Juvenile Probation Department. I'd first like to say thank you to the panel for providing us with very robust information about this issue. I personally believe that you guys have covered a number of areas that are important for us, beginning with the data and the research and then the practical aspect of it. I'd like to ask particularly about some sort of practical takeaways. You've talked to us about community level disparities and certainly the systemic issue. What are some practical takeaways that you would offer to us as we go back into our institutions and try to address these issues?
Well, our experience in New York, I think, reinforced some of what we have seen around the country, that you need to bring to bear to your most important decisions about removal, for example, but also about moving children from place to place, about the type of service that a family can use and needs, and about what's going on in the family generally. The more you can bring to bear parent advocates who have been through the experience of losing their children, getting them back, and dealing with the system, the more you can bring to bear community partners who live in the same neighborhoods and who understand what you do and do not understand about that community and about a particular family. The more you can bring to bear those sort of resources to the decisions that you have to make, the better your chance of making a decision based on the real needs of the children as opposed to what you think you are seeing but you may not be.
Eric, did you want to add to that?
One of the things that fascinates me to some degree is how little we actually know about the communities in which our children come from. I think that in my own county, the discovery of the settlement houses, I always have to chuckle. The idea of discovering something that had been around for 100 years doesn't really weigh too well with our observation of the people that we serve. But I think we miss a real opportunity when we don't listen to, as leaders, listen to our workers who are really in those communities. Because it's not always a physical structure like a settlement house, but oftentimes there are leaders in our communities that are parts of churches or boys clubs, or sometimes just talking to the people that you're working with about who are the positive leaders in that community, and then seeing how you can connect the work that you're trying to do with what they're wanting to do. And what you often find is that they have the same aspirations for their communities as you have for the people that you're serving. But I think it's an untapped resource. I think we have a tendency to think we know what's there without actually going there, or we know what the needs are without actually talking to the people whose needs we're trying to address. I think it's a lost opportunity that really needs to be paid a little bit more attention to.
If I may, so the academic jargon that I would wrap around that is discover the social capital.
I like that.
Great. We have time, I think, for one more question before we'll have to bring this to a close.
particularly to Dr. Mattingly and Mr. Fenner. Both of you gentlemen have successfully retired from careers in public service. To you gentlemen, what could you offer to us who are still in the trenches and of the, what might you say, of the sort of political pushback, if you will, and even pushback from communities of this work, and how to sort of maneuver that and dodge those barrage of bullets?
Boy, that's a great question. I don't know if I would say, I don't know that you ever successfully retire from child welfare.
It stays with you.
I think you survive it and you move on. But that's a very interesting question because, quite honestly, if you don't manage your political environment, sometimes it doesn't matter how good your ideas are. You have to be very cognizant of the desires and wishes of your elected officials, let's say, just as an example of your political environment, and seeing how you can align the work you're trying to do with what they're trying to do. And when you can't find that alignment, sometimes it's worthwhile to try and influence what they're trying to do with something. And I've noticed that politicals love to be invited to events as speakers and to receive awards. And you'd be surprised how cheap you can get a trophy. But you find that there's a willingness to come if you're going to recognize them. But I think that in today, with regard to child welfare practice, there really has to be more time spent with managing that political environment and really demonstrating to the political how this work in the community is in alignment with what they're trying to accomplish. So I think that's a critical piece to do.
Great. I have John, and then we'll bring it to a close. Thanks.
I just want to get on my soapbox for a minute. There are today, as we speak, tens of thousands of real heroes out there in the streets of our communities making life or death decisions about children and about strengthening their families and about making choices that don't necessarily offer you the best choice in the world. And the addition that they bring to the public's value in this country is not attended to enough. And I think it's incredibly important to keep in mind that they are out there, and for this time in their life, maybe they'll work for us for 20 years, maybe they'll work for us for 2 years, but they are doing the Lord's work in our cities and communities throughout this country, and we owe them a great debt of gratitude.
Thank you. What a great place to end this part of this discussion. As we said at the beginning, I don't think any of us at Chapin Hall think that this is an area where the answers have yet emerged and the knowledge of what to do next is there. This is going to take many more discussions, much more brain power, much more energy to think through and to act to make children's lives better. But we hope that this helped contribute to that ongoing conversation. Our panelists, again, will stay a few minutes afterwards here if you want to come up and ask questions one-on-one, or just get autographs or anything like that. But I want to thank those of you who listened on the web. Again, the web posting will occur with the PowerPoint so people can go back and see that. I want to thank you who came in person, and I most of all want to thank our panelists who gave us a lot to chew on this important topic. So thank you.